At a prestigious bank in downtown Denver, a black man walked in for a simple withdrawal. The teller didn't ask his name, didn't even check his ID. She glanced once, then slid the slip back across the counter with a flat, dismissive tone. Moments later, he was being shoved out the glass doors by security. No questions asked, no chance to explain. While the white man who had just left before him carried $18,000 in cash without so much as a second look. His identification was tossed to the sidewalk like trash, and not a single person inside that bank thought to stop it. Not the manager, not the staff, not the customers. But what none of them realized was, they had just thrown out the man who owned the building. And when he came back, he wasn't coming back to ask for money. He was coming back to remind them who they worked for. Dorian Blake walked into the Clearwell Trust and Bank, Union Street branch at exactly 8:30 a.m. The glass doors parted smoothly, allowing the crisp Denver morning air to flow in behind him. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting sharp golden reflections on the polished marble floors. The bank buzzed with the quiet hum of business. Employees in tailored navy suits moved briskly behind the counters, while clients stood in neat rows waiting for their transactions. The soft chime of the service bell rang at regular intervals. Everything operated like a well-oiled machine, just as Dorian envisioned when he built this institution from the ground up. Yet today, he wasn't there as the CEO. No meetings, no press conferences, no high-profile deals. Just a routine withdrawal of $12,000 from his personal account. Something any customer should be able to do without complication. He wasn't dressed in a custom suit or a designer watch. Just a neatly pressed light blue button-down, a pair of khaki pants, and clean sneakers. His presence was unassuming, blending seamlessly into the morning crowd. As he stepped further inside, his sharp eyes caught sight of a man at the counter. A middle-aged white man clad in a charcoal gray blazer. The teller smiled warmly as she counted out neat stacks of cash, handing them over without hesitation. Dorian caught a glimpse of the amount on the transaction slip as the man turned. $18,000. The customer pocketed the money, nodded in appreciation, and strolled toward the exit, untouched by scrutiny. Unquestioned, unbothered, Dorian exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening for a split second before he unclenched it. He had seen this before, felt it before, but today more than ever, he was determined to ensure that his own establishment was not fostering that same brand of silent prejudice. Keeping his expression neutral, he moved toward the teller counters. The line was short, and soon he found himself standing in front of a blonde woman in a crisply pressed navy blazer. Her nameplate read Brooke Hastings. Unlike the previous transaction he had just witnessed, Brooke did not offer a smile. She barely glanced at him before reaching beneath the counter and sliding a clipboard in his direction. "Fill this out," she said flatly, her tone mechanical and detached. No greeting, no pleasantries. Dorian studied her face for a moment before lowering his gaze to the form. A standard withdrawal slip. He had no issue filling it out. Procedures were procedures. Still, something about her demeanor felt off. He maintained his composure, retrieved a pen from his pocket, and quickly wrote down the required information. Once done, he slid the clipboard back toward her along with his driver's license. She took the slip but didn't even glance at the ID. Instead, she looked at the amount and immediately pushed the form back across the counter. "We can't process this," she said curtly, folding her arms. Dorian frowned, his fingers brushing against the rejected form. "Excuse me?" Brooke didn't blink. "We don't handle large cash withdrawals like this." His brow furrowed. "I just watched that man walk out with $18,000 in cash." He gestured toward the exit where the previous customer was now stepping onto the busy sidewalk. "You didn't hesitate for a second with him." Brooke's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's different." Dorian leaned slightly forward, his voice calm but firm. "How exactly?" For the first time she averted her gaze, but not out of discomfort, more like irritation. Instead of answering, she turned her head slightly, eyes flicking toward the glass-walled office in the back where Cheryl Whitman, the manager, stood observing. And just like that, Dorian knew. He followed Brooke's gaze. In the glass-walled office at the back of the bank, Cheryl Whitman stood, arms crossed, watching the interaction with thinly veiled scrutiny. A woman in her mid-40s, clad in an immaculately tailored suit. She had the sharp, calculating look of someone who had already made up her mind long before she pretended to consider the facts. The moment their eyes met, she gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible but enough for Brooke's posture to straighten, her confidence bolstered by the silent approval of her superior. When she turned back to Dorian, something colder flickered in her eyes. She exhaled sharply, as if already exhausted by the conversation. "I told you," she said, tapping the slip of paper still resting between them. "We can't process this transaction." Dorian inhaled slowly, measured, keeping his patience in check. "And I'm asking you why." Brooke didn't answer immediately. Instead, she tapped her manicured nails against the counter in a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if stalling. Finally, she sighed, tilting her head. "It's just unusual," she said, her voice carrying that artificial sweetness people used when pretending to be reasonable. "A cash withdrawal this large, it's suspicious." Dorian let the word hang in the air between them, heavy and deliberate. Suspicious. He felt it settle in his chest, in his bones, just like it always did when people like Brooke used polite words to mask uglier intentions. He knew this game. He had played it his whole life, maneuvering through unspoken rules that dictated who was given trust without question, and who had to prove over and over that they even had the right to exist in certain spaces. You didn't seem suspicious when he did the exact same thing, Dorian said, his voice even and controlled. He didn't need to point. They both knew who he meant. "So tell me, Brooke, what's the difference?" A flicker of something flashed in her eyes. A split-second hesitation before she recovered, shaking her head. "Sir, I don't make the rules." Dorian let out a soft, humorless chuckle. "You don't make the rules," he echoed. "But you sure as hell know how to apply them selectively." Brooke bristled, her lips pressing into a tight line. "I need to get my manager," she said abruptly, her tone clipped. She didn't wait for a response before turning sharply on her heel and disappearing into the back office. Dorian didn't move. His fingers rested against the cool surface of the counter, tapping idly, matching the steady thud of his heartbeat. The air in the bank had shifted, subtle but noticeable, as if the space itself had sensed the tension simmering beneath the surface. He could feel eyes on him, other tellers glancing in his direction, customers shifting uncomfortably, as if they knew something was happening but didn't want to get involved. A few feet away, a woman, white in her early 50s, watched him with thinly veiled curiosity. Diane McAllister, he read from the name tag pinned to her purse. She was standing near the customer service desk, hands folded over the strap as if debating whether to say something. Dorian met her gaze briefly, and for a moment, she hesitated before offering a small, uncertain smile. He didn't return it. Not because he was angry at her specifically, but because he knew how this played out. People like Diane watched. They whispered they noticed when things like this happened, but they rarely did anything about it. The door to the back office swung open, and Cheryl Whitman stepped out, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. Her expression was unreadable. Brooke followed closely behind, her chin slightly lifted, the subtle smirk of someone who knew they had backup. Cheryl stopped in front of the counter, smoothing down the front of her blazer as she studied Dorian. "Good morning, sir," she said, her voice polished and professional, the kind of tone reserved for handling complaints from difficult customers. "I understand you're trying to make a large withdrawal today." Dorian met her gaze evenly. "I am." Her smile was polite but didn't reach her eyes. "Unfortunately, we have certain security protocols in place for transactions of this size." Dorian tilted his head slightly. "Security protocols?" "Yes," she said smoothly. "For the safety of our customers and staff, we have to be extra cautious with high-value withdrawals." Dorian folded his arms across his chest, drifting slightly. "So what exactly does that mean for me?" Cheryl offered a sympathetic expression, the kind meant to seem apologetic but was really just condescending. "It means we need to verify some additional information before proceeding." Dorian exhaled through his nose. "You mean my information because clearly, You didn't need to verify anything when that man withdrew more than I did. Cheryl's smile didn't falter, but there was something in the way her jaw tensed that told him she wasn't used to being challenged. I can't speak to other customers' transactions, she said, her tone growing sharper. But in this case, I'll need to confirm the source of these funds and verify your last deposit amount. Dorian felt his patience slip another inch. You have my account number right in front of you. Look it up. Cheryl's expression hardened. I'm going to need you to cooperate, Mr. Blake. Dorian laughed, short and incredulous. Cooperate? I'm standing here giving you everything you need to do your job. And you're still finding reasons to refuse me. That's not protocol. That's profiling. The word hit the air like a slap. He saw it in the way Cheryl's eyes flickered, the way Brooke stiffened behind her, and how the room itself seemed to inhale, waiting for what would come next. Cheryl's lips parted, then closed again, as if weighing her next words carefully. Then, without looking away from Dorian, she lifted a single hand and made a small, sharp gesture across the room. A figure stirred, Colton Briggs, the bank security guard, a broad-shouldered white man in his mid-30s. He straightened from where he had been leaning near the entrance, his gaze flickering toward Cheryl, then to Dorian. He didn't hesitate. He started walking toward the counter. Dorian didn't move as Colton approached, the heavy boots echoing against the polished tile. The security guard was tall, broad, the kind of man who carried his authority like a badge he didn't need to flash because people like him never had to prove they belonged. His expression was carefully neutral, but his posture wasn't. Shoulders squared, hands loose at his sides. He walked with the slow, deliberate pace of someone preparing for an unnecessary escalation. Cheryl didn't bother glancing at him. She didn't have to. The silent command had already been given. She kept her attention fixed on Dorian, waiting, watching. She expected compliance. They always did. Dorian let out a slow breath, controlled and steady, keeping his expression unreadable, even as something hot curled in his chest. He had seen this play out too many times before. A scene as old as time. A black man being treated like a threat in a space where he was supposed to belong. I'm going to ask you again, Cheryl said, her voice still polished and perfectly professional, as if she wasn't actively orchestrating his removal. Can you verify the source of these funds? Dorian's jaw tightened. My paycheck, he said evenly. Like every other time I've deposited money into this account. Cheryl tilted her head slightly, her eyes flicking to Brooke, who stood stiff behind the counter, arms crossed. And can you provide the exact amount of your last deposit? Dorian stared at her, feeling the weight of the room pressing down. Other customers were pretending not to listen, while tellers were pointedly avoiding looking in his direction. Diane McAllister, the older white woman standing near the customer service desk, shifted uncomfortably, her grip tightening on the strap of her purse. She wanted to say something. He could see it in the way she fidgeted, the way her mouth opened slightly before she decided. Not my place. Dorian dragged a slow hand down his face, exhaling through his nose. You have my account number right in front of you, he said, forcing his voice to stay even and calm. Why don't you look it up? Cheryl's expression didn't change. That's not how we do things here. A low, humorless laugh escaped Dorian's lips. That's interesting, he said. Because I've banked here for years and not once have I been asked these questions. Not once have I been treated like I don't belong. He took a step closer to the counter, his voice sharpening. So tell me, Cheryl, what exactly about me makes you think I don't? Silence, thick and stifling. Brooke's gaze flickered toward Cheryl, uncertain now. Even she knew they had crossed the line from policy into something else entirely, but Cheryl didn't flinch. If anything, the slight curve of her lips suggested she enjoyed the power she thought she held in this moment. Her gaze drifted past Dorian, a flick of the eyes that said more than words ever could. Colton Briggs stopped beside him, close enough that Dorian could feel his presence, a shadow looming just at the edge of his periphery. I'm going to have to ask you to leave, Bolton said, his voice flat and impersonal, as if Dorian were nothing more than a minor inconvenience, as if he weren't a customer at the very bank he built. Dorian turned his head slowly, meeting the guard's eyes for the first time, He held his gaze, searching for any sign of awareness, doubt, or hesitation. He found none, yet he knew Colton didn't make the call. Cheryl did, Brooke did. All of them had decided the second he walked through those doors that he didn't belong, that he wasn't deserving of the same courtesy, the same trust, the same ease that had been extended to the man before him. The difference between them? Skin, nothing else. And now they were sending him out. Dorian inhaled deeply, then exhaled, his patience thinning by the second. He had played this game long enough. He reached into his pocket, slow and deliberate, and pulled out his phone. He unlocked the screen with a tap, raised it slightly, and hit record. "You're refusing to process my withdrawal," he said, his voice calm but clear enough to carry. "Despite having my identification, my account information, and despite processing an even larger withdrawal for a white customer right before me." Brooke tensed. Cheryl's jaw twitched. Colton's stance stiffened. "I'm going to ask you again," Colton said, his voice a shade less certain now. "Step outside. And if I don't?" Dorian didn't hesitate. He reached out and firmly wrapped his hand around Dorian's forearm, fingers curling with just enough pressure to make it clear he wasn't being asked anymore. Dorian barely had time to brace himself before he was yanked backward. His shoulder collided with Colton's solid frame as the guard spun him toward the door, shoving him forward with just enough force to make him stumble. A sharp gasp broke through the silence. Someone muttered, "What the hell?" But no one stepped in. His feet barely caught traction before he was shoved again, this time harder, until his back hit the glass door. The impact sent a sharp shock up his spine, but Dorian didn't let it show. He refused to let them see it. The door swung open under the force, and the next thing he knew, he was outside. The cold morning air hit him like a slap. Behind him, Colton stood in the doorway, arms crossed, looking down at him with impassive disinterest. And then, the final insult. His ID, the very thing they refused to acknowledge, the very thing that proved exactly who he was tossed to the ground at his feet. The small plastic card hit the pavement with a sharp, lifeless clatter. Something burned in Dorian's chest. Something hot and raw. Something dangerously close to the line between contained rage and outright fury. But before he could move, before he could reach down, a shadow passed over him. A second security guard, Terrence Hall. A black man in his mid-30s, tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion, stepped forward. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes when he crouched down and his fingers closed around the discarded ID, dusting it off with deliberate, almost reverent care before handing it back to Dorian. "This place," Terrence muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Dorian to hear, "always does this." Dorian took the ID, his fingers brushing against Terrence's just briefly before the man pulled back. Terrence exhaled, shaking his head. "Doesn't matter if you got a degree, if you got the credentials. If you keep your head down and do everything right," he murmured, his voice carrying the weight of too many years of quiet endurance. "They don't want us here. Not in the offices, not at the top. We're security, we're janitors, we're the numbers they need to make it look like they give a damn." He glanced back at Colton, his expression filled with something between resignation and restrained disgust. "But this," his voice dipped lower, just for Dorian, "this ain't new." Dorian stared at him for a long moment, heart still pounding, adrenaline still thick in his veins. Then slowly he reached back into his pocket. He pulled out his phone again, but this time he wasn't recording, he was dialing. The line rang once, twice. Then Nathan Caldwell's crisp voice answered. Dorian's grip tightened. "I need you at the Denver branch now." There was a beat of silence on the other end of the line. Then a sharp inhale. "I'll be there in 15. Dorian ended the call, sliding his phone back into his pocket, his fingers curling around his ID, the edges pressing into his palm, grounding him, keeping the fury simmering beneath his skin from boiling over. His eyes flicked to Terrence, who was still standing beside him, hands on his hips, gaze flickering between Dorian and the glass doors. Where Colton remained stationed like a watchdog, Terrence let out a short, humorless laugh. "Well," he muttered, shaking his head, "this is about to get real interesting." Dorian didn't respond. He didn't need to. The next 15 minutes stretched like hours. Inside, through the glass, he could see the bank continuing on as if nothing had happened. Cheryl was back behind the counter, speaking to Brooke, her movements sharp, efficient, dismissive. Colton remained by the door, arms crossed, eyes occasionally flicking toward Dorian but never holding his gaze for long. Diane McAllister had disappeared, probably deciding it was easier to remove herself than to witness something uncomfortable. Typical. Then finally, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The driver barely had time to put it in park before the door swung open and Nathan Caldwell stepped out. Nathan was a man who commanded attention without asking for it. White, in his early 50s, salt and pepper hair, sharp suit, sharp eyes. Unlike the performative professionalism Dorian had faced inside, Nathan's authority was real, earned, not projected. He didn't waste a second. The moment his gaze landed on Dorian, his expression tightened, then he was moving. Colton straightened as Nathan approached, uncertainty flickering across his face. He must have recognized him, must have realized this wasn't just another customer, but Nathan didn't even acknowledge the guard. He stepped right past him, the air in the bank shifting as the glass doors parted for him, his presence slicing through the tension like a blade. Dorian followed his steps. Measured, controlled, though the heat of anticipation coiled in his chest. Terrence hesitated for only a second before trailing behind. The moment Cheryl turned and saw Nathan, her expression flickered, something between confusion and realization. She straightened, smoothing down the front of her blazer and quickly composing herself. Brooke, standing just behind her, went stiff. "Mr. Caldwell," Cheryl greeted, her voice forced, her professional mask slipping into place. "I wasn't expecting." Nathan didn't give her the chance to finish. Clearly, his tone was cold and cutting. "If you had been, this wouldn't be happening." Cheryl's lips parted, then closed, a shadow of discomfort passing over her face. But she quickly recovered. "Sir, there seems to be some." Nathan cut in smoothly. "Oh, there's no misunderstanding. The only thing I'm confused about is why my CEO was just forcibly removed from his own bank." A dead silence fell over the room. Brooke visibly paled. Colton stiffened by the door. Even the tellers who had been pretending not to listen froze mid-transaction. Cheryl blinked, then blinked again. For the first time, her perfectly composed expression faltered. Her mouth opened a second too late. "Save it," Nathan said, his voice like steel. He locked eyes with Brooke. "You refused his transaction." Brooke's throat bobbed. "I was just following protocol." "Protocol," Nathan echoed, his tone edged with disbelief. He let the words settle, stretching into the silence. "Is that what we're calling blatant racial profiling now?" Brooke opened her mouth, words failing to come out. Nathan didn't wait for an answer. His attention snapped back to Cheryl. "Tell me, Cheryl," he said, slow and deliberate. "Did you even check his account before you decided he wasn't qualified to access his own money?" Cheryl inhaled sharply, her composure finally cracking. "Sir, yes or no?" Nathan's voice was quiet, lethal. Cheryl hesitated for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Nathan exhaled through his nose, a slow, calculated breath. Then he looked around the room, at Brooke, at Colton, at the tellers who had watched and said nothing. He let the silence stretch, let it smother them under the weight of what had just been exposed. Then, finally, "You're done here," he said. Cheryl went rigid. "Sir," effective immediately. Nathan continued as if she hadn't spoken. "And if I find out this kind of treatment has been happening to other customers," his gaze flicked to Colton, "or if any employee under my leadership thinks they can use their position to enforce their own biases." He let the sentence hang, unfinished, the threat embedded in the silence. "You won't just lose your job. You'll answer for it legally." Colton had the decency to look away. Cheryl's face flushed deep red, a stark contrast to the icy confidence she had held just minutes ago. "This is completely unnecessary," Dorian finally spoke, voice sharp and incredulous. "You had me thrown out like a criminal." You refused to even look at my ID, refused to check your own system. You knew exactly what you were doing, Cheryl. Cheryl flinched. Nathan turned back to Dorian, his expression shifting, apology flickering in his eyes. Though he knew words wouldn't fix what had already happened, he nodded firmly, then turned to Terrence. "And you?" Nathan asked. Terrence stiffened. "Sir." Nathan studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly. "You're promoted, effective today." Terrence's eyes widened, caught off guard, his stance shifting. You deserve better than working under people like this," Nathan said simply. Then he turned back to Dorian. "Dorian," he said, the familiarity in his voice standing in stark contrast to the cold authority he had used with Cheryl. "You want this branch cleaned out?" Dorian didn't hesitate. "Completely." Nathan nodded once then, as if the decision had already been made. He turned back to the stunned employees. "Everyone involved in this incident is to be reported for bias training. Mandatory." His gaze lingered on Colton. "That includes security." The weight of his words settled over the room like a final nail in the coffin. Cheryl opened her mouth again, but no words came out. Dorian exhaled, slow and steady. Then, without another glance at her, he stepped forward, reclaiming his place at the counter. Brooke stepped aside immediately. Nathan gestured toward the computer. "Process his withdrawal." This time, no one dared argue. The crisp stacks of bills were counted out and placed neatly in front of Dorian. His money, his, not something to be debated, not something to be justified, just his. As he took the cash, his gaze flicked to Terrence. The man was still standing there, looking slightly dazed as if trying to process everything that had just unfolded. Dorian slid one of the stacks toward him. "Take the day off." Terrence frowned. "Sir." Dorian held his gaze. "Take the day off." Terrence hesitated, then slowly reached for the cash, fingers curling around the bills. Dorian turned, finally meeting Cheryl's gaze one last time. "You should have checked my ID," he said. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. This time no one stopped him.